Hi, everybody. So congratulations on making it through the third module. We're moving on to the fourth module, which we will term the European Renaissance. A little bit problematic, that term, but so what I want you to do before I even say anything else, I want you to hit pause and jot down 3 things for yourself that you think of when you think of the European Renaissance. Maybe what does Renaissance mean? What do you remember learning about the Renaissance at some point in some kind of world civ class, probably, maybe a literature or art class. So hit pause and just jot down a few things. So good. I guess we're going again. So it's it's a difficult term. It means rebirth, which is probably what you wrote down, if you wrote down anything about what it meant. What is it the rebirth of? In theory, it's the rebirth of the classical period, the ancient period, and for the Italians, that would mean the rebirth of Rome, the Roman time period. There is everything Greek sort of filtered through Rome. So although there is a bit of a throwback to Greece, it's really a throwback to Rome more than anything else, because that's how Europe got its Greek influence, is through Rome. When did the Renaissance happen? Tricky question. Because it didn't happen at the same time in every country. It's generally, one can say it happens in Italy before it happens in France or England. Spain was sort of doing its own thing. The Renaissance is sometimes connected to religious changes in some countries. It's a very difficult thing to make blanket statements about, but for years and years and generations, we have said those things. So I just kind of want to problematize it a little bit. Actually, it is no longer cool in scholarly circles to say Renaissance, although people still do. It's not like you got like, if you do, but it's more preferred to say early modern, to distinguish medieval from early modern, partly because of the value laden quality of the word Renaissance. It's like everything wonderful happened then, which means that everything that was before it was really bad. So particularly in an attempt to not put value on one period over another, or to perhaps even say, do these periods really even exist? Medieval and early modern are kind of more contemporary terms that historians will use. So I haven't even made it past the first opening title slide, and I had a lot to say about that. So when I'm 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, this is a very, very sort of, I'm giving you a big overview of the qualities that we see in the Renaissance, and then I will move to a different, move more specifically to some English stuff. We will talk about England and Italy, I think, for this class. I think that's how much we're going to get to. France does have its Renaissance. Like I said, Spain is going through its own thing during some of the same time period, in particular the Reconquista, right? Spain became largely Islamic in the earlier period. So by the time you're in what we would talk about as the Middle Ages for Spain, it's not so much the Christian Middle Ages in Spain, it's the Islamic Middle Ages there. So there's kind of a completely different thing happening there. So just because we don't have a ton of time, and because we kind of have to talk about the English Renaissance, and because actually the Italians are responsible for big changes in scenic design. So that's the other reason for taking on them. So these are some of the general things that are said to be true of the Renaissance, or the early modern period. The revival of classical learning, that's really sort of what I referred to before. The an increased awareness of nature. Part of that is that there is an increasing secular, like there's an increasing value on secular things. If the Catholic Middle Ages puts the divine in front of everything else, right? The working for the afterlife and what's going to be the state of your soul at the end of the world. Those are the things that are the most important. So nature is of the here and now, and perhaps a little less emphasized, a little. So there is an increase in men being, or women, people being aware that they are individuals. These things happened in the Middle Ages too, but they don't show up so much in the artwork. So if you look back to the Greeks and the Romans and you look at their statuary, you see statues that look like real people. You don't really see a lot. I mean, most statuary in the Middle Ages is of religious figures, and it's adorning churches. So it's either, a crucifix or a bunch of saints. And they are, because they're saints, they're going to necessarily be depicted in a saintly way. So the interest is not in kind of like, I want to capture the essence of Saint Stephen. It's I want to capture the beauty of a divine person. And so the artist, with some exceptions, the artists in medieval sculpture are not seeking, or even in painting, they're not seeking to create individuals visually. So Renaissance art very much is looking at making lifelike images in both sculpture and in painting. And a big thing that is necessary when you talk about the Renaissance, you can't really have an artistic Renaissance without an economic boom, without some sort of economic stability. I think I brought that up before, sort of a theme for me. You have to have, people can't be living in fear of their lives. They can't be living in fear of invasion too much. They can't be living in that way and really create lovely work. So you have to have those things. So here is a little caveat, right? This, for all those things that I just said, here is the caveat. I shall read it. Scholars no longer believe that the Renaissance marked an abrupt break with medieval values, as is suggested by the French word renaissance, literally rebirth. Rather, historical sources suggest that interest in nature, humanistic learning, and individualism were already present in the late medieval period. We could actually say they were present in the 12th century. And they became dominant in the 15th and 16th century Italy, concurrently with social and economic changes, such as the secularization of daily life, the rise of a rational money credit economy, and greatly increased social mobility. That's from the Encyclopedia Britannica, not exactly the most fancy place to find. So if the Encyclopedia Britannica is saying it, it means it's like pretty common knowledge. So, we need to see the early modern rebirth Renaissance as part of a trajectory. It's not a massive break from what was happening in the Middle Ages. There are some religious breaks that happen, but artistically, it's a shift and a kind of a branch that goes off off of the same tree. One of the things I didn't mention on that previous slide has to do with humanism, which is really where we get the idea of humanities. And it's I find it a problematic word. It really sort of means that you study the arts to be a better person, that all of this learning helps us make us be better people, better citizens, and that it's worth it to be well-rounded. That's kind of the humanist way of looking at the world in a nutshell. So there, like I said, 12th century, there's this whole like little mini Renaissance that happens in the Middle Ages. So that's one of the problems with calling the later period the Renaissance, is because, well, there's a Renaissance is just like a little that happens, and it happens along the timeline. It doesn't just happen at this particular time. So I want to talk about visual arts a little before we get to theater, because I think just the same way that that the Romanesque and Gothic churches and Romanesque and Gothic crucifixes that I kind of pointed you in those directions give you a sense of sensibility changing during the Middle Ages. There's when you look at some of the art that's being produced in Italy in particular in the Renaissance, you can get a sense of what's happening visually for them. So in the Middle Ages, we really didn't look, we didn't look at too much art from then, but it probably isn't surprising to think that a lot of it is a little two-dimensional, because the drama is a little two-dimensional. You're dealing with stock characters or allegorical characters. Those are figures who represent something, right? They're not like fully formed human beings. And a lot of the visual arts is similar to that. So one of the big genres or formats, that's not the right media, in the Middle Ages is mosaic. So I think everybody's probably familiar with, like you break up glass and you put the little things, and you probably made stepping stones as a kid or something in middle school. So mosaics in the Middle Ages are very sort of high-end art form, and they decorate churches very broadly. And they generally have a pure gold background, and then there's figures. So there's no sense of these people are in some space. In fact, most of the time they just seem to be in gold. We could look at that and say, oh, look, those artists, like a little kid, those artists didn't know how to make it look like somebody was sitting on a real chair, or make it look like they were standing in a house. They may not have, but that may have also been because they weren't interested in it. Because again, the spiritual, especially in a church decoration, the spiritual is what's important. So if it's a parade of saints, let's say, why would they be anywhere other than in a gold heavenly kind of place? There are a lot of those, and then a lot of the saints all look the same. There are traditions for people like St. Peter and St. Paul. You can tell the difference between them because they have specific hair. And but most saints in paintings, it's not because of what they look like that you can tell who they are, but because of what they carry. Saints carry an attribute, and that tells you who they are. So for instance, I don't know if you've heard of the Catherine wheel. It's a firework. Well, the Catherine wheel comes from the idea that Saint Catherine was tortured on a wheel. I guess you get strapped to it and I don't know if you get rolled around. I'm not really sure how that works, but the Catherine wheel is named for St. Catherine, who was tortured on a wheel, which is a torture device. And that's just kind of weird anyway. So, but she'll be holding this wheel, like this spoked wheel, and that's how you know that's St. Catherine. It's not because of what she looks like. Anyway, so one of the big things that happens in the early modern Renaissance is a discovery of perspective. It's very exciting. So this is a detail from An Annunciation by Simone Martini. And this is kind of cool because really this is sort of the end of the Middle Ages in Italy. The 1300s is the time where they transition into the Renaissance, because they're winning the race on making it into the Renaissance. So here we have over here on stage left, our right as we're looking at it, the Virgin Mary. If you're not familiar with the traditions in Christian art, the Virgin Mary is always in blue. It's usually more of a sky blue, but when you're working with mosaics, you have kind of specific colors that are available to you. So this is the moment where the angel comes to her and says, "Hey, Hail Mary, blessed are you amongst women." Right? It is the Ave Maria, if you happen to know that prayer, the Hail Mary. Those are the words of the angel who comes to Mary and says, "Hey, you're going to have God's baby." So I'm sorry if I'm offending you, but that's true. So she looks kind of unhappy about the words that are being given to her. So there is some exploration of the psychological point for her. Like, really, like if you were like a 15-year-old girl and some vision showed up and said, "Hey, you're going to have God's baby," you would be a little bit disconcerted. So here's the angel, and very frequently you see lilies my cursor's not working here. In lilies are a representation of the Virgin. So for them to see those is typical. Anyway, what I really want to show you here is the fact that there's a totally gold background, except for that vase of lilies. and I'm not really entirely sure what's at the top there. I think you can look at it and see if you think it looks like the dove. Does that look like a dove right in the center? Which would make sense. That would be the Holy Spirit is about to come down and enter Mary and to impregnate her. And I think that the angel's holding an olive branch, which would be the branch of peace, right? And you can tell it's an angel because he has wings. So there is some sort of architectural framework for this, but that's the frame of the actual picture. The Gothic arches that are up there, that is like a three-dimensional frame. Okay, so that's a detail of a late medieval Italian Annunciation. And this is a detail from a Renaissance, 150 years later, Annunciation by Botticelli, who you may have heard of. He's one of the most famous Northern Italian Renaissance painters, usually associated with like Venice. So I picked this one because I think it's a funny picture. If this is supposed to be the moment, that if this moment doesn't occur, mankind doesn't ultimately get saved, right? The interest that Botticelli is putting in the picture is more on the architecture than on Mary's reaction, perhaps, or anything else. It's very odd. What he's doing is he's showing off. He is showing off his ability to use linear perspective. And again, this is a detail. It's actually a bigger picture, and there's other things going on in different parts of it. It is a Renaissance building. It's architecture that the viewer looking at this originally, that viewer would have recognized that kind of architecture. So it would be like, seeing, I don't know what a contemporary piece of architecture would look like for us, and seeing Mary being put into that time period. Although she's got her blue robe. But the amount of interest in, hey, how do I make these pillars look like they're actually jutting out from that back wall? And even more clever, when you look through the back wall, you see a landscape in the background. And that's done with a different kind of perspective. He's using atmospheric perspective there, which is simply put the idea that as things get further away, they get more blurry. It's actually it's the idea that portrait mode on your iPhone uses. It blurs out the stuff in the background. But we still have an angel. This time it looks like he's carrying the lilies. Do you see the gold coming in from up above the angel, and it's coming across? That's, again, I think we're to understand that that's the divine spirit coming down to move towards Mary, to enter her. But really, it's a very curious composition. Not only is he interested in, hey, look at me getting this 3D effect with this stuff coming out, but hey, look, I can do drapery folds. look at how well skilled I am in putting in this curtain and it being pulled back there, along with the other knickknacks and things that are in the room. So with linear perspective, I'm sure that a number of you know what that is. The idea is that there's a vanishing point. So the vanishing point in this picture, in the frame that I've got it in, the vanishing point is not like in the center of the picture. It's actually over on the angel's side. If you were to draw a picture where you went, I'm sorry about my cursor not working, but if you were to draw the bottom line of the pillars moving back towards that landscape, and the same thing on the top, and that you draw those lines and at some point they come together, that's your vanishing point. And that's the way you construct a perspective drawing for, particularly for architecture. If you are just dealing with figures in blank space, you don't have to deal with it. So linear perspective, huge advent for the Renaissance. So here's a picture of a painting from in between those two parts, like it's 1425, so that's in the middle of those two other pieces I just showed you. Again, most of these paintings are of religious subject matter. The subject matter has not changed quite so much, but the way that it is being represented, it's changed. So again, the architecture that in this picture would have looked familiar to Italians looking at this in the middle of the 1400s. So it's anachronistic, which is sort of a throwback to how the biblical stories were told in the Middle Ages. So not everything's changed. It's St. Peter healing a cripple and the raising of Tabitha. This is another thing that is not different from the Middle Ages. When you may remember, I showed you a picture that was Jonah being fed to the whale and Jacob hearing about Joseph's death. And then there was like, I don't know if it was the entombment of Christ, but there were the three pictures next to each other. They were all symbolically connected. We've got two things here that are both St. Peter performing miracles. So St. Peter is represented twice in this picture. The first time over on stage right, our left as we're looking at it, St. Peter is in the gold. And remember just now I said you can tell St. Peter and St. Paul. St. Peter is the one that looks like, he always has a full head of white hair and a white beard. There's lots of people that I think of who look like that. I was thinking of Hemingway or something. I don't know why. Or maybe Santa Claus, except not fat. But that's St. Peter. And if he has an attribute, by the way, it's usually keys, because he has the keys to, Christ gave him the keys to the kingdom. Sometimes he's seen with a little St. Peter's model from the basilica. So here he is over here, and there's this cripple that's down on the ground reaching up to him, and he's about to touch him and heal him. And over on stage left, or at the other side of our right, is Tabitha, who apparently was dead, and she's brought back to life. You can see, look at the guy with the light blue who's like, what the heck is going on? And everybody looks a little shocked. And there's Tabitha sitting up from her bier. It looks like she was about to be buried or something. So anyway, the subject matter is actually less important than the linear perspective, which is being represented by all those lines. Those are not in the original picture, the white lines, but they are showing you where the vanishing point is. It goes back there. And every line in the architecture and the eye goes back to it. Just to the side of the vanishing point, you might notice two fellows, one in pink and one in a lovely embroidered cape, who are not biblical figures. Those are Renaissance dudes. They're probably the patrons of this painting. So, yeah, so patronage. You go back a couple slides, and I said that you need a good economy for the Renaissance to happen. You need people who have extra money who are going to support the artists. So as the Italian, and when we talk about Italian theater, we'll talk more about this, but basically as the Italian city-states, right, it's not one unified country, it's a bunch of different city-states. As they grow, particular families become very powerful. The Medicis, Gonzaga, I think was the name of one of them. There's just a whole bunch of families who are bankers and diversify their portfolios and end up being the ones with political and economic clout. And they usually end up being like Duke of whatever, Milan or Florence. And they are, they give a lot of, they hire artists a lot. And so so if you drive around even Winchester, you will sometimes see somebody's getting like gardening done, and there'll be a sign out front that says, you know, whatever the gardening company is that's doing it. I just drove past one yesterday, which was a blacktop. You know, somebody had their driveway resealed, and it was a blacktop company, and they had their sign. And they're sponsoring you as the owner goes, yeah, I'll take the discount on my blacktop by putting a sign out there for you. This is the Renaissance version of that. These are two dukes or, you know, whoever, I don't know who they are, probably gave the money probably for whatever this project is that this painting was done, and they got stuck in the painting. And there's absolutely no concern about the fact that Renaissance dudes are in a painting with St. Peter. Just as there's no concern about the fact that St. Peter shows up twice in the same painting. It's all cool. This is a very, very early version of Vanishing Point. This artist is probably the first person to use it in paintings, and it's a little bit, it's not anywhere near as good as actually if you were to trace the lines on this one, which is, you know, 50 years later. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff. But so going back to Rome, architecture is one of the things that the Renaissance is looking to copy. So if you remember that Romanesque, everything's like moving up, stained glass, the pointy arches, and this sort of feeling of I can imagine what heaven is like that you might get in a Gothic cathedral. That's all bad. And in fact, the term Gothic is derogatory from a Renaissance standpoint. Goth refers to barbarian tribes. So to refer to that architecture as Gothic was once upon a time a negative name. You can kind of see from these two pictures that they are copying ancient Roman temples. So you have a temple on the right, the one that's sort of broken down, the Temple of Vesta from Rome. And it's the model for the Renaissance building on the left, which is also in Rome from 1300 years later. And it is supposedly the spot where St. Peter was buried, or not was buried, but was executed. St. Peter was executed, but being crucified upside down. Another way that you can tell any picture that's St. Peter's crucifixion, because I don't know who else got crucified upside down, just him. So that's just an example of how specifically they were copying architecture. Round buildings took on a great significance. The circle and the round building generally is associated with birth and baptism, or with death and like a mausoleum. Completely random fact, doesn't really matter. So one of the other things you can see here is this increased interest in the psychology of the subject in art. The Simone Martini Annunciation, which was the one on gold, had Mary sort of like, whoa, I don't want to hear this news. That is the beginnings of a Renaissance exploration of the psychological right there. Even though the background is sort of medieval, her response is very early modern. So these are both images of expulsions. So meaning Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which, remember the interest in the human form? So the lovely thing about Adam and Eve is that they're naked. So if you're going to represent them either on stage or in imagery, you have to deal with this with the human body. So on the left, we have this English 12th century Psalter, which is really quite lovely in its own way. So a Psalter is a book of Psalms, a book of like prayers and songs from the Bible. And very frequently, so this would be a book for a rich person, probably a lord or lady. It was created probably in a monastery and really represents a lot of wealth. If you ever see any of these things, they're tiny. These are tiny little things. If you go to the cloisters in New York City or other museums and you have a chance to see an illuminated manuscript, which is what this is, just look at one and just take a close look at it because they're really rather remarkable. These are tiny things. The Psalter is probably that big. This is probably as big as the image actually is on my computer screen. So you have the angel, archangel, with this really, really crappy attempt to represent an apple tree. That is supposed to be an apple tree on the top. It looks like a pineapple, except pineapples don't grow that way. So there's the angel saying, "You guys are bad," and sending them out of the garden. And they have their, this is the attempt at the fig leaves to cover up their crotches. You could try and take a good look at the difference in their chests. I mean, obviously, whoever did this had never seen a naked woman. Probably had only seen themselves naked. It was done by a man. The angel's magnificent wings helps us distract us from the really like absolute inability to represent the human body really in any sort of realistic way. And there, Adam kind of looks a little sheepish as he's looking back at the angel, but the horror of what they've done is not really being captured there. And then what you have on the bottom is what happens after they are booted out of Eden is that the rhyme, there's an old, not like a nursery rhyme, but it's an old poem about Eve spun and Adam delved, which is digging. So that after they were kicked out of the beautiful life in Eden, they actually had to do work. And Eve spun or made yarn, and that's why that's a distaff that she's holding. And I think in Mankind there was reference to distaffs, to like that is very, very frequent. Like, woman, stay in your place, mind your distaff, right? Go back to your distaff. Kind of go back to your stitching, go back to your sewing, because this is man's work. So there's Eve. There's a little baby next to her, because that's the other thing is that Eve is said to be punished with the pangs of childbirth because of it being her fault that they got booted out. I can't really tell what's going on with her right hand as she's reaching back. No. And there is Adam supposedly digging in the earth. And, what's this poor monk who did this trying to do? I don't know. There's a gold background because that's what we normally do. But all of a sudden he's confronted with the fact that Adam can't be digging a gold background. So I'll make some dirt. And look, I've conquered the apple tree image, so I'll use it again. God bless this altar. All right, so I'll stop laughing at the I love medieval art, but it is funny. And we'll look over here at Masaccio's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, 1425, so right around the same time as we saw those lines in the early perspective. And I sure hope that you can see these images better than I can, because my little face is sort of covering them up on my screen. I'm hoping yours looks better. But really what you've got is a detail in the center, and then the full picture, and it's a panel in a church. I think it's a panel on a wall in an architectural environment where this is painted, I think. So there's the angel at the top. Check out the foreshortening going on, right? We can tell that the angel is in the air and is looming over them, because the head is closer to us than the legs, and that is a considerable advent, like that's a considerable new thing that's happening in the Middle Ages, the ability to create a foreshadowed shortened image. So if my hand is here, but I do this, how do you draw that? You have to understand that you have to draw what you see, not what you know is there, because that doesn't look like a hand that we think of. In fact, it looks really, really weird. But if you draw exactly what you see, then maybe it's going to look like a hand foreshortened. So that's what's going on with the angel. And then we have this beautiful Adam and Eve, who are in the throes of despair, who are, Adam is pretty anatomically correct, and Eve, if the painter didn't really know how to deal with her chest, he's covered her up in a way that we'll buy it. And the emphasis anyway is not really so much on that as it is on their faces, which are really kind of at the center of the picture, and the grief that they're having right there. But I mean, in comparison of 250, 300 years, there's a huge comparison between these two. I mean, it's ridiculous how different they are. So when we talk about sort of the height of the Renaissance, we start to get into the 1500s. Usually the names that you might know: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Sanzia, I think is his last name. Anyway, Raphael is usually how he's referred to. And this painting, which is again, it's on the wall inside the Vatican. And what you can see down there on the bottom left is actually the top of a doorway, and it's up above those doorway. The School of Athens. So this is just kind of like represents the Renaissance in all its ways, because it's saying, hey, look at the olden times. Back in Athens, they had all these cool learners and artists and inventors. So all of the greats from classical antiquity, and they are totally in what they imagine to be a Roman temple, even though it says School of Athens, which would be in Greece, but they are totally, that's very Roman looking. And you can look this up, and every single one of these people is identified as a specific mathematician, philosopher, scientist from the ancient past. Although the guy down there looking blue at the front is usually considered to be Michelangelo. And that's kind of a tribute to Michelangelo that Raphael put into this picture. Anyway, up on the, I don't know if you can see it because of my face, but the inset is showing the vanishing point, which is really kind of right between Aristotle and Plato, who are the two guys in the center, who would be, of course, the two great dudes from Athens. So that is the vanishing point. All of the architecture, the lines on the floor, the mosaic that's on the floor, everything all leads to actually the point right between Plato and Aristotle, who are like the two gods of the time period. So there's what that's what I have to say about an overview of the Renaissance. One of the other things that happens is a Protestant Reformation. And it doesn't happen for every country. But when Protestantism becomes a force to reckon with, that obviously is going to help the move towards secularization, towards the real, the everyday. So certain countries that is a really important part of moving towards the Renaissance. So I will shut up now and let you take a break before I move on to the English Renaissance. See ya.